Edgar Cayce. Edgar Cayce, on March the 18th of 1877 to January the 3rd of 1945, was an American clairvoyant who claimed to diagnose diseases and recommend treatments for ailments while asleep. During thousands of transcribed sessions, Cayce would answer questions on a variety of subjects such as healing, reincarnation, dreams, the afterlife, past lives, nutrition, Atlantis, and even on current and future events. Cayce described himself as a devout Christian and denied being a spiritualist or communicating with spirits. He is regarded as a founder and a principal source of many characteristic beliefs of the New Age movement. As a clairvoyant, he collaborated with a variety of individuals, including the osteopath Al Lane, homeopath Wesley Ketchum, printer Arthur Lammers, and Wall Street broker Morton Blumenthal. In 1931, he founded a non-profit organization, the Association for Research and Enlightenment. A popular and highly sympathetic biography of Cayce's titled "There is a River" was published by journalist Thomas Segru in 1942. Cayce was influenced by a variety of traditions and sources. During the Second Great Awakening, Cayce was raised in the group of Thomas and Alexander Campbell, who founded the Disciples of Christ, a church which sought to restore the original Christian teachings and practices. Mesmerism influenced Phineas Parkhurst Quimby's New Thought movement, which promoted the practice of medical clairvoyance. One of Quimby's patients, Mary Baker Eddy, who later founded her own new religious movement, Christian Science. On the other hand, spiritualism was influenced by Helena Blavatsky, who was the founder of theosophy. Her writings were detailed accounts or topics on subjects such as reincarnation, Atlantis, root races, and the Akashic records. Homeopathy and osteopathy were pseudoscientific forms of alternative medicine prevalent in Cayce's lifetime. He initially attributed his own healing to the care of an osteopath, and he later collaborated with one. Edgar Cayce first achieved local notoriety for having lost his voice, yet having been able to speak during hypnosis. After initially reporting his voice had spontaneously and inexplicably returned on its own, he later began publicly crediting a local osteopath with having restored his voice. The osteopath began employing Cayce as a medical clairvoyant who could reportedly diagnose patients at a distance through supernatural means. After declaring bankruptcy, he returned to the role of medical clairvoyant, collaborating with homeopath Wesley Ketchum. In 1910, Ketchum's description of Cayce's readings was covered in a widely reprinted story in the New York Times. When a falling out with Ketchum occurred, Cayce traveled to Selma, Alabama. An additional collaboration with printer Arthur Lammers led Cayce to Dayton, Ohio. The final chapter of his life was spent in Virginia Beach, Virginia, where he oversaw an institute of his own creation. On October 10, 1922, Birmingham Post-Herald article quotes Cayce as saying that he had given 8,056 readings to date. He recorded some 13,000 to 14,000 readings after that date. Other spiritual abilities attributed to him included astral projection, prophecy, mediumship, access to the Akashic records, the Book of Life, and ultimately seeing auras, astrology, and utilizing dream work. Cayce was born on March 18, 1877, in the Christian county of Kentucky. His parents, Carrie Elizabeth and Leslie Burr Cayce, were farmers and the parents of 6 children that were raised in the Disciples of Christ. In December 1893, his family moved to Hopkinsville in Kentucky. They lived at 705 West 7th on the southeast corner of 7th and Young Streets. where he received an 8th grade education, and his education ended in the 9th grade because his family could not afford the cost. On March 14, 1897, Cayce became engaged to Gertrude Evans. In September, the papers announced that he had taken a position with John P. Morton and that he had left for Louisville, where he began an apprenticeship at the photography studio of W. R. Bowles in Hopkinsville, and he became proficient in his trade. In February of 1900, Hart the Laugh King, a stage hypnotist who performed in Hopkinsville, returned in 1903, decades later, who was named as having hypnotized Cayce in an attempt to restore his voice. According to a 1901 newspaper account, on the night of April 18th in 1900, Cayce lost his voice and was unable to speak above a whisper. The condition reportedly forced him to leave his job as a salesman for work in photography instead. In May in 1900, the local paper reported that Cayce had been unable to speak above a whisper except when under hypnosis, when his voice returned. It was in June that the papers reported that he was attending business college in Louisville. On February the 12th of 1901, the papers reported Cayce had awoken with his voice spontaneously and inexplicably recovered. The following year, in April of 1902, he authored a public endorsement that attributed his cured voice to the treatment of osteopath and electromagnetical doctor A.C. Lane. In May of 1902, he got a job in a bookshop in Bowling Green, Kentucky. He returned to Hopkinsville to visit his parents in September. The following January, he returned to the town to attend his sister's wedding. He married Gertrude Evans on June 17th in 1903, and she moved to Bowling Green. By June the 24th, the papers published stories of Cayce going into a trance to help osteopath A.C. Lane diagnosis of a patient who was not physically present. Cayce denied being a spiritualist, saying he was an active member of the Christian Church. A 1904 article mentioned his refusal to charge for readings. In 1904, he claimed he had developed the card game Pit and sent it to Parker Brothers. Gertrude and himself had 3 children, Hugh Lynn, Milton Porter, and Edgar Evans Cayce. Lane revealed the activity. What activity? To the professionals at the boarding house, one of whom was a magistrate and a journalist, and the state medical authorities forced him to close his practice. So he left to acquire osteopathic qualifications in Franklin. He and a relative opened a photographic studio in Bowling Green. On December the 25th of 1906, a fire burned down his photo studio. His first son was born on March the 16th of 1907. Later that year, a second fire burned down his studio. In January of 1908, he authored a query to the newspaper about the phase of the moon at a certain time in 1864. In 1908, he declared bankruptcy. Leslie Harrington Ketchum was born in Lisbon, in Ohio on November the 11th of 1878 to Saunders C. Ketchum and Bertha Bennett, and he was the oldest of 7 children. He graduated from the Cleveland College of Homeopathic Medicine in 1904, where he practiced medicine in Hopkinsville in Kentucky until 1912. He went to Honolulu in Hawaii via San Francisco in 1913 and opened a new practice. He returned to California in 1918 and established an office in Palo Alto, where he practiced until the 1950s. He retired to Southern California around 1963, where he settled in San Marino, near Pasadena. In 1964, he penned The Discovery of Edgar Cayce that was published by the A.R.E. Press, and ultimately he died on November 28th of 1968 in Canoga Park. Wesley Harrington Ketchum was a homeopath who worked with Cayce from 1910 to 1912. Cayce found work at the H.P. Tresla photography firm. In the fall of 1910, he was the subject of increasing publicity for his medical readings. On October 10 of 1910, he was profiled by the New York Times in a story titled, "Illiterate Man Becomes a Doctor When Hypnotized." The medical fraternity of the country is taking a lively interest in the strange power said to be possessed by Edgar Cayce of Hopkinsville of Kentucky to diagnose difficult diseases while in a semi-conscious state, even though he did not have the slightest knowledge of medicine when not in this condition. During a visit to California last summer drive, W.H. Ketchum, who was attending a meeting of the National Society of Homeopathic Physicians, had occasion to mention the young man's case, and he was invited to discuss it at a banquet attended by about 35 of the doctors of the Greek letter fraternity given at Pasadena. Ketchum made a speech of considerable length giving an explanation of the strange psychic powers manifested by Cayce during the last 4 years, during which time he has been more or less under his observation. This talk created such widespread interest among the 700 doctors present that one of the leading Boston medical men who heard his speech invited Ketchum to prepare a paper as a part of the program of the September meeting of the American Society of Clinical Research. Ketchum sent the paper but did not go to Boston. The paper was read by Henry E. Harpower, M.D. of Chicago, a contributor to the Journal of the American Medical Association that was published in Chicago. Its presentation created a sensation, and almost before Ketchum knew that the paper had been given to the press, he was deluged with letters and telegrams inquiring about the strange case. He distinctly wished and understood that his presentation was purely ethical and that he attempted no explanation of what must be classed as a mysterious mental phenomena. Ketchum is not the only physician who has had opportunity to observe the workings of Mr. Cayce's subconscious mind. For nearly 10 years, and strange power has been known to local physicians of all the recognized schools. An explanation of the case is best understood from Ketchum's description in his paper read in Boston a few days ago, which follows. About 4 years ago, I made the acquaintance of a young man 28 years old who had the reputation of being a freak. They said he told wonderful truths while he was asleep. I, being interested, immediately began to investigate, and as I was from Missouri, I had to be shown, and truly, when it comes to anything psychical, every layman is a disbeliever from the start, and most of our chosen professions will not accept anything of a psychic nature, hypnotism, mesmerism, or whatnot, unless vouched for by some MD high up in the professions and one whose orthodox standing is questioned. By suggestion, he becomes unconscious to pain of any sort, and strange to say, his best work is done when he is seemingly dead to the world. My subject simply lies down and folds his arms, and by autosuggestion goes to sleep. While in this sleep, which to all intents and purposes is a natural sleep, his objective mind is completely inactive and only his subjective mind or consciousness is working. I then gave him the name of my subject and the exact location of the same, and in a few minutes he began to talk as clearly and distinctly as anyone. He usually went into minute detail in diagnosing a case, and especially if it was a very serious case. His language is usually of the best, and his psychologic terms and description of the nervous anatomy would do credit to any professor of nervous anatomy, and there is no faltering in his speech, and all his statements are perfectly clear and concise. He handles the most complex jawbreakers with as much ease as any Boston physician, which to me is quite wonderful in view of the fact that while in his normal state, he is an illiterate man, especially along the line of medicine, surgery, or pharmacy, of which he knows nothing. On October the 20th of 1910, the Hopkinsville papers announced Cayce's return to town with his father handling with the business end of his hypnotic readings. As part of stock company that had been set up in November of 1910, his photography studio was advertised in the local paper. In 1911, press accounts told of Lane having cured Cayce by consulting Cayce's own reading while under hypnosis. On January 17, 1911, Cayce and his father gave a public demonstration at a suite in Louisville's Seelbach Hotel. In June, Nashville newspapers advertised Cayce's readings. In 1911, he was briefly mentioned in an encyclopedia. In 1912, Cayce and his father filed suit for $28,000 against A.D. No Sr. and Jr., who had been under contract to assist in the medical clairvoyant practice. On March 28th, a second child was born. However, unfortunately, the baby died on May the 17th. Gertrude later became ill with tuberculosis. According to Cayce's account, in 1912, he discovered that Ketchum had gambled with their money, and as a result, he quit the company immediately and returned to the Trusla photography firm in Selma in Alabama. In March of 1913, the papers covered a breach of contract lawsuit involving Cayce's business. On July the 31st of 1912, he was elected as an officer of a Sunday school organization in Selma. In February 1915, the local papers reported that his voice had returned after 3 months of silence. On February the 8th of 1917, an event in New York was held supposedly receiving a telepathic message from Cayce, who was in Alabama. In 1920, his claims were published along with a suggestion that he would soon host Arthur Conan Doyle. His increasing popularity attracted entrepreneurs who wanted to use his reported clairvoyance. Although he was reluctant to help them, he was eventually persuaded to give readings, and this left him dissatisfied with himself. A cotton merchant offered him $100 a day for readings about the cotton market, but despite his poor finances, he refused the merchant's offer. Some people wanted to know where to hunt for treasure, and others wanted to know the outcome of horse races. From 1920 to 1922, he participated in attempts to use psychic powers to drill oil wells at San Saba in Texas. On May 1921, the Texas papers announced plans for Cayce's Petroleum Company to begin drilling about 6 miles north of San Saba. In June 1922, he advertised Free Baby Picture Day at his studio in Selma. On October the 10th of 1922, he was profiled about his medical clairvoyance. On October 18th, papers reported Cayce had addressed a local writers group covering topics like reincarnation and evolution of the soul. That month, he addressed the Birmingham Theosophical Society. In November, he gave a talk to a Birmingham women's group, and a local paper ran a statement by the Friends of Edgar Cayce, mentioning plans for a hospital in Birmingham. In September 1923, he hired Gladys Davis, who would serve as his secretary for the next 2 decades, transcribing his readings in shorthand. By October, he was associated with the Cayce Institute of Psychic Research. Arthur Lammers, a wealthy printer and student of metaphysics, persuaded Cayce to give readings on philosophical subjects in 1923. He told him that in his trance state that he spoke about Lammers' past lives and reincarnation, in which Lammers believed. Reincarnation was a popular contemporary subject, but is not an accepted part of Christian doctrine, and because of this he questioned his stenographer about what he said in his trance state and remained unconvinced. He challenged Lammers' statement that he had validated astrology and reincarnation. Cayce said, "I couldn't have said all that in one reading?" Of which Lammers replied, "No, but you confirmed it. You see, I have been studying metaphysics for years, and I was able by a few questions with the facts you gave to check what is right and what is wrong with a whole lot of the stuff that I have been reading. The important thing is that the basic system which runs through all the religions is backed up by you." Cayce's stenographer recorded the following. In this we see the plan of development of those individuals set upon this plane, meaning the ability to enter again into the presence of the Creator and become a full part of that creation. Insofar as this entity is concerned, this is the third appearance on this plane, and before this one, as the monk, we see glimpses in the life of the entity now as were shown in the monk, in this mode of living. The body is only the vehicle ever of that spirit and soul that waft through all times and always remains the same. Cayce was unconvinced that he had been referring to reincarnation. However, Lammers believed that the reading opened up the door and continued to share his beliefs and knowledge with him. Lammers seemed intent upon convincing Cayce because he felt that the reading confirmed his own strongly held beliefs, and he asked Cayce to come to Dayton in Ohio to pursue metaphysical truth via the readings, and he eventually agreed. Cayce produced considerable metaphysical information in Dayton, which he tried to reconcile with Christianity. Lammers, who wanted to determine the purpose of Cayce's clairvoyant readings, and he wanted to put up money for an organization supporting Cayce's healing methods. He decided to accept the work and asked his family to join him in Dayton as soon as possible. By the time his family arrived near the end of 1923, however, Lammers was in financial difficulties. At this time, Cayce directed himself to readings centered around health. The remedies reportedly channeled often involved electrotherapy, ultraviolet light, diet, massage, less mental work, and more relaxation. They were noticed by the American Medical Association, and Cayce felt that it was time to legitimize his operations with the aid of licensed medical practitioners. He reported that in a trance in 1925, the voice advised him to move to Virginia Beach in Virginia. By 1925, he was a professional psychic with a small staff of employees and volunteers, and his readings increasingly had occult or esoteric themes. Morton Blumenthal, who worked at the New York Stock Exchange with his trader brother, became interested in the readings, and he shared his outlook and offered to finance his vision, and Blumenthal bought Cayce a house in Virginia Beach. The Association of National Investigations was incorporated in Virginia on May the 6th of 1927. Blumenthal was the president, and his brother and several others were vice presidents. Cayce was secretary and treasurer, and Gladys was assistant secretary. To protect against prosecution, anyone requesting a reading was required to join the association and agree that they were participating in an experiment in psychic research. Moseley Brown, head of the psychology department at Washington and Lee University, became convinced of the readings and joined the association in early 1928. In August 1928, Edgar Cayce was listed as a Bible class teacher affiliated with the local Presbyterian Church. On October the 11th of 1928, the dedication ceremony of the hospital complex was held. The complex contained a lecture hall, library, vault for storage of the readings, and the offices for the researchers. There was also a large living room, a 12-car garage, servants' quarters, and last, but not least, a tennis court that contained the largest lawn. In fact, the only lawn between the Cavalier and Cape Henry, and its first patient was admitted the following day. The facility enabled checking and rechecking the remedies of his goal. There were consistent remedies for many illnesses regardless of the patient, and he hoped to produce a compendium for the use by the medical profession. Shankar A. Baisi, a chemist who also used clairvoyant knowledge to produce medicines, collaborated with him to produce etomidine. The raison d'etre for the cures was the assimilation of needed properties through the digestive system from food taken into the body that were all treatments including all schools and types of treatment that were given in order to establish the proper equilibrium of the assimilating system, and there was a months-long waiting list. It was comprised of salt packs, poultices, hot compresses, chromotherapy, magnetism, vibrator treatment, massage, osteopathic manipulation, dental therapy, colonics, enemas, antiseptics, inhalants, homeopathy, essential oils, and also mud baths that were prescribed. Substances included oils, salts, herbs, iodine, witch hazel, magnesia, bismuth, alcohol, castoria, lactated pepsin, turpentine, charcoal, animated ash, soda, cream of tartar, aconite, laudanum, camphor, and finally gold solution. These were prescribed to overcome conditions that prevented proper digestion and assimilation of needed nutrients from the prescribed diet. The aim of the readings was to produce a healthy body, removing the cause of a specific ailment. Readings would indicate if the patient's recovery was problematic. Blumenthal and Brown had ambitious plans for a university, dwarfing the hospital, and a parallel service for the mind and spirit rivaling other universities in respectability. The university was scheduled to open on September the 22nd of 1930. On September 16th, Blumenthal called a meeting of the association and took over the hospital to curb the expenses. He ended his support of the university after the first semester and closed the association on February the 26th of 1931, and Cayce removed the files of his readings from the hospital and brought them home. During the Depression, he turned his attention to spiritual teachings. In 1931, his friends and family asked him how they could become psychic. Out of this apparently simple question came an 11-year discourse, which led to the creation of study groups. In his altered state, he relayed to the groups that the purpose of life is not to become psychic, but to become a more spiritually aware and loving person. Study group number 1 was told that they could bring light to a waiting world, and the lessons would still be studied in 100 years. The readings were now about dreams, coincidence or synchronicity, developing intuition, the Akashic records, astrology, past life relationships, soulmates, and also other esoteric subjects. On June the 6th of 1931, 61 people attended a meeting to carry on Cayce's work and form the Association for Research and Enlightenment, ARE. In July, the new association was incorporated. Cayce returned his house to Blumenthal and bought another. In 1931, Cayce promoted a quack medicine formulation called etomidine or nascent iodine. People seeking a reading from him were asked to join the ARE. This helped insulate him from charges of fortune-telling, which was illegal in some U.S. states, as he was not directly charging a fee for his services, but receiving a salary from the member-supported ARE. Apart from supporting Cayce and his staff, a major emphasis of the early ARE was the encouragement of small groups devoted to spiritual study, prayer, and meditation. In November 1931, Cayce's wife Gertrude and secretary Gladys Davis were arrested for pretending to tell fortunes. When charges were dismissed, papers noted that his readings included tales of ancient civilizations, including ancient Egypt, El Dorado, and Atlantis, and his readings described Bimini Island as a mountaintop of Atlantis. In February 1932, he gave a public lecture on the lost continent of Atlantis. The association's first annual congress was held in June 1932. Speakers discussed metaphysical and psychic subjects, and he performed public readings. From 1932 to 1936, Cayce predicted that the year 1936 would be a year of cataclysmic changes. In February 1933, he predicted that San Francisco would be destroyed by earthquake in 1936. In April 1935, he lectured in the District of Columbia. In 1935, they were again arrested, this time in Detroit for practicing medicine without a license, and Cayce was given probation. In January 1936, he gave a reading predicting the destruction of Los Angeles and San Francisco, followed by New York City. In March 1936, he reported a dream. He proclaimed that, "I had been born again in 2100 AD in Nebraska." The sea apparently covered all of the western part of the country, as the city where I lived was on the coast. The family name was a strange one. At an early age, as a child, I declared myself to be Edgar Cayce, who had lived 200 years before. Scientists, men with long beards, little hair, and thick glasses were called in to observe me. They decided to visit the places where I said I had been born, lived and worked in Kentucky, Alabama, New York, Michigan, and Virginia. Taking me with them, the group of scientists visited these places in a long, cigar-shaped metal flying ship which moved at a high speed. Water-covered part of Alabama. Norfolk, Virginia, had become an immense seaport. New York had been destroyed either by war or an immense earthquake and was being rebuilt. Industries were scattered over the countryside. Most of the houses were built of glass. Many records of my work as Edgar Cayce were discovered and collected. The group returned to Nebraska, taking the records with them to study. These changes in the earth will come to pass, for the time and times and half-times are at an end, and there begins those periods for the readjustments. His son Hugh Lynn proposed that they develop a library of research into the phenomena exhibited by his father and sponsor study groups, with Cayce himself doing 2 readings a day. The association accepted this, and Hugh Lynn began publishing a monthly bulletin for association members. The bulletin contained readings on general interest subjects, interesting cases, book reviews on psychic subjects, health hints from readings, and news about psychic phenomena in other fields. Hugh Lynn continued to build files of case histories, parallel studies in psychic phenomena, and research readings for the study groups. The association activities remained simple. Members raised funds for an office, library, and vault, which they added to the Cayce's residence in 1940 to 1941. Association membership averaged 500 to 600, with the annual turnover about 50%. The other half was a solid basis for research, an audience for case studies, pamphlets, and bulletins, including the Congress Bulletin, which was a yearbook and record of Congress events. A mailing list of several thousand served people who remained interested in his activities. Members were drawn from a wide variety of Christian denominations, theosophy, Christian Science, and spiritualism, and ARE did not oppose any religious organization. Both of his sons served in the military during World War II, and both were married. Hugh Lynn in 1941 and Edgar Evans in 1942. A 1942, a limited edition, preceded the first trade edition of the only biography written during Cayce's lifetime, Thomas Segru's There is a River, that was published in March of 1943. In this, interest in Cayce increased. According to the book, in May of 1889, while reading the Bible in his hut in the woods, a young Cayce saw a woman with wings who told him that his prayers were answered and asked him what he wanted most of all. He was frightened, but he said that most of all he wanted to help others, especially sick children, and he decided he would like to become a missionary. According to the book, the next night, after a complaint from the school teacher, his father ruthlessly tested him for spelling, eventually knocking him out of his chair with his exasperation. At that point, Cayce heard the voice of the lady who had appeared the day before. She told him that if he could sleep a little, they could help him. He begged for a rest and put his head on the spelling book. When his father came back into the room and woke him up, he knew all the answers. In fact, he could repeat anything in the book. His father thought he had been fooling before and knocked him out of the chair again. Eventually, Cayce used all his school books that way. By 1892, the teacher regarded Cayce as his best student. On being questioned, he told the teacher that he saw pictures of the pages in the books. His father became proud of this accomplishment and spread it around, resulting in Cayce becoming different from his peers. According to the book, shortly after this, Cayce exhibited an ability to diagnose in his sleep. He was struck on the base of the spine by a ball in a school game, after which he began to act very strangely and eventually was put to bed. He went to sleep and diagnosed the cure, which his family prepared and which cured him as he slept. However, as amazing as this was, this ability was not demonstrated again for several years. According to Segru's text, local hypnotist Al Lane offered to help Cayce tore his voice again. When Lane put him into trance, he communicated vocally. Cayce told Lane to give him a suggestion to increase blood circulation to his throat. Lane gave the suggestion, and Cayce's throat reportedly turned bright red, and after 20 minutes, he, while still in a trance, declared the treatment over. On awakening, his voice was said to have remained normal. Relapses occurred, but were reportedly corrected by Lane until the cure was eventually permanent. Lane asked him to describe Lane's ailments and to suggest cures, and reportedly found the results accurate and effective. Lane considered Cayce's ability as clairvoyance and suggested that he should offer his psychic diagnostic service to the public. However, he was reluctant since he had no idea what he was prescribing while asleep and did not know if his remedies were safe. He told Lane that he did not want to know anything about a patient since it was not relevant. He agreed on the condition that readings would be free and specified that if the readings ever hurt anyone that he would cease and will never do another. He began with Lane's help to offer free treatments to the townspeople. Lane described Cayce's method as a self-imposed hypnotic trance, which induces clairvoyance. Reports of Cayce's work appeared in newspapers, which prompted a number of postal inquiries. He said that he could work as effectively with a letter from an individual as with a person present in the room. Given a person's name and location, he claimed that he could diagnose the physical and mental conditions of what he called the entity and provided a remedy. Nevertheless, he was still reticent and worried because one dead patient was all he needed to become a murderer. His fiancée agreed, and few people knew what he was doing. Hypnotic subjects were commonly believed to be susceptible to insanity or poor physical health. Cayce attained further national prominence in 1943 after the publication of Miracle Man of Virginia Beach in Coronet magazine. From June 1943 to June 1944, he did 1,385 readings. In August 1944, he collapsed. When he took a reading on his situation, he was instructed to rest until he was well or dead. He and Gertrude went to the Virginia mountains, where he had a stroke in September and died on January the 3rd of 1945 at the age of 67. He was buried in Riverside Cemetery in Hopkinsville in Kentucky, and his wife Gertrude died 3 months later. Gina Cerminara wrote the 1950 book, Many Mansions, which explores his work. In 1963, psychic Ruth Montgomery popularized Cayce's catastrophic predictions that she described as a polar shift. In 1967, A journalist called Jess Stone authored Cayce's biography, titled The Sleeping Prophet, a book on Cayce and Atlantis that was published in 1968, and in 1968 Kurt Gentry's novel The Last Days of the Late Great State of California told of a cataclysmic California earthquake that had been foretold by Cayce in 1941. In 1970, David Kahn's work, My Life with Edgar Cayce, was posthumously published. 1970 saw the publication of a book on Cayce's readings on the Dead Sea Scrolls. His two sons, Edgar Evans and Hugh Lynn Cayce, wrote The Outer Limits of Edgar Cayce's Power in 1971. In 1974, his predictions were cited in a book titled California Superquake, 1975 to 1977. In 1978, Cayce's followers reported a collaboration with Stanford Research Institute, a psychic research group unaffiliated with Stanford University. In the 1980s, the New Age author Lori Toy popularized the I Am America map inspired by Cayce's prediction of Earth changes. Religious historian Mitch Horowitz credits Cayce with popularizing core themes of New Age spirituality, particularly the concept of religious universalism, noting in 2019 that his teaching sought to marry a Christian moral outlook with the cycles of karma and reincarnation central to Hindu and Buddhist ways of thought, as well as the Hermetic concept of man as an extension of the divine. Cayce's references elsewhere to the causative powers of the mind. The spiritual is the life, the mental is the builder, and the physical is the result that melded his cosmic philosophy with tenets of New Thought, Christian Science, and mental healing.